Welcome to Up Close, the show where we get into the pack of cards with the top poker players in the world. Tonight, we're fortunate to be with one of the top poker players in Europe, a tournament director, as well as someone who knows about or is part of the history of poker, gentleman Liam Flood. Liam, let's start with the beginning. You've been gambling all your life. How did it start? Was your father a bookmaker?
Father was a bookmaker. My brother was a gambler. We all played poker, or cards of some sort. And when I left school, I went working in Arnott's in Dublin, which was a retail store. Very 9 to 5 job. And every Friday night I used to play whist, which was a community type of game, and then we'd play poker afterwards.
How did you get into bookmaking from there?
Well, that was sort of a hereditary type of action because my father got ill, and I was the only one in the family who could drive him to the races because at that time I was working for myself. I was in the furniture business, so I could take the time off to drive him to the track.
So how then did you get into the poker scene?
Well, I got friendly with Terry Rogers, who was probably the most famous Irish bookmaker.
What do you remember about him?
He was big man, big voice, very gruff, but very generous person. And when Terry spoke to you, you think he's shouting. But if he's not shouting, you're in trouble. If he's whispering to you, you know you're in big trouble.
So how did you get involved with him later on?
Well, we started with poker. I started playing poker with him on Friday nights in a private game. And that was the reason how I became a reasonably big bookmaker. One Friday night I won £1,500, and I parlayed it the following day at Phoenix Park Racecourse. And I became a big bookmaker nearly overnight. And then we started running charity poker tournaments, draw poker, in hotels for hospitals principally. And we'd have 200 or 300 people playing.
What was the game? It was draw poker?
5-card draw, yeah. That was the only game in Ireland really at the time.
Were you quite good at it? Were you winning in those games?
No, I was terrible. In actual fact, I always was a very bad poker player until No Limit Hold'em came in, because I gambled too much. But for some unknown reason, No Limit tournaments, I suddenly discovered that I could do okay in them.
And they started after Terry brought Hold'em back to Ireland.
Yeah, Terry was in Los Angeles, probably 1979 or something like around that time, and
Why was he there?
He was over there to buy sweeps tickets. At that time, we had a type of lottery, which was the Irish Sweepstakes, and it was run twice a year. And they were all sold all over America illegally. So Terry would go out there and try and buy tickets from the people that had drawn a horse in the particular race, and he'd bring it back and make money as a bookmaker on his investments over there. So this particular year he had 3 days to spare, and he said he'd go over and see Vegas. Went to Vegas and met Benny Binion, and the World Series of Poker was on. Now at that time it was very small, but then he brought the Americans over to Dublin. All the top players came.
How did he get the Americans back over to Ireland? Was it because he had won so much money?
No, not really. But he did make a very big book on the World Series of Poker, which was never done before. Like Terry was prepared to lay odds like 33 to 1 or 100 to 1 people, and the Americans never saw prices like this before. There was always under or over the line, so it was an even money shot, and he was the first person to do it. And I think somebody must have got jealous of the amount of money he was turning over, because we finished up in jail.
That was the first year you were over.
No, it was second year.
What do you remember about the first time you went to Vegas then?
Well, the first time we went to Vegas, like, we were like kings. You know, the limo was sent out to the airport and we were all collected. We all stayed in the Golden Nugget. Everything was paid for. We didn't have to put our money in a hand in our pocket for any money, except for gambling. And most of us lost all our money.
What was your role there? Were you Terry's advisor? Or?
I was Terry's clerk. In other words, I wrote the bets into the book for him. And I wasn't very good at it, but I got the job done.
Where would that take place?
Well, the first morning we were in the coffee shop, and Billy Baxter came down, and he says, "Jerry, what's the line?" And Jerry says, "Who do you want to back?" And suddenly, before we left breakfast, we had taken in $25,000 because Billy Baxter had backed 4 or 5 people.
And it was your job to write them all in the book.
Yeah.
Do you remember how the book turned out?
Oh, we won. I got paid. So in other words, I came back with dollars.
What did you think of all those Americans back then? Who stood out in particular?
Well, Bill Smith, I suppose, at the time was, I had to admire him because he was never sober and he won the World Series. I was friendly to a certain extent with Tom McAvoy, Chip Reese, Bobby Baldwin, Amarillo. Those guys knew me well because I was Terry's man, and that's how they knew me. In actual fact, some of them, like Bob Stupak, come up to me last year and he says, "Oh, I thought you were dead," but he was getting me mixed up with Terry.
And you played with them as well, didn't you?
Yes.
What was that like?
It was awesome at the time, but I was fearless, you know. But I learned a lot because I remember a few different hands, which I won't go into, but afterwards I realised that I had made mistakes. So from that point of view, it was very worthwhile.
When did you start to feel like you were becoming a good poker player?
I suppose 1984, when I was lucky enough to win the Irish Eccentric International Poker Tournament in the Isle of Man.
What was that trip about?
Well, Terry felt that nobody in Ireland could give proper security for the money involved in a tournament because he had trouble in Killiney the previous year. So we went to the Isle of Man.
You mean people looking to rob everybody?
Afraid of
Yeah.
of that happening. And there was no insurance in the hotel at the time that would cover it. I'm sure it wouldn't happen now, but that was the case then. And we went to the casino in the Isle of Man. And we got a deal with them to run it, and there was no charges or anything like that. And we got the top American players to come over.
What do you remember about the tournament when you won it?
Well, I remember that I was supposed to be the tournament director. And I said to Terry, because there was only 33 players or something like that, at 2,000 ahead, I said to Terry, why don't you and a few other guys put me into it? And he got Eric Drake and Dale Conway, and the three of them put me into it, and I beat Gabe Kaplan in the final, having demolished Jack Keller in the meantime.
He was third.
No, he wasn't, but I was sitting at a table with Donica, Jack Keller and me. That's the way it was. So in other words, in today's language, I had position on Jack, but Jack was raising every pot. And Donica said to him at one stage, he says, "You know you'll do that once too often." "What do you mean?" he says. And he says, "Mind your man." He's pointing at me. So about 10 minutes later, Jack raised. I called 7-8 suited. My favourite hand ever since. The flop came 7-8-8. Jack raised after the flop, and I called. And then after 4th Street, Jack raised again and looked at my cards, and I called, and on the river he bet again, and I went all in. So about 10 minutes later, Jack was out of chips. And he was world champion at the time.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the world champion.
He was
then.
the reigning world champion at that time. So that was the high point of my career.
Was Hold'em played at as high a level then as it is now?
Not really. However, it was played as competitive, because when we went to Vegas, if there was a satellite on a one-table satellite, and if there was an Irish person in a one-table satellite, they were probably favoured to win it. We knew the value of chips better than a lot of Americans, because most of the Americans were not at final tables, whereas we were at a final table at least once a week.
And that was because of the Eccentric Club.
Yes, indeed.
To start from the beginning with the Eccentric Club, how were you involved?
Well, I was involved because of my bookmaking interests and my poker playing with Terry Rogers. And I don't think either of us were that good a poker player, but we did run the draw poker tournaments for charity. And then when Terry brought the game back to the Eccentric Club from Vegas, that's how we learned it. And I think in 1982, he would have brought Doyle Bronson and Bobby Baldwin and Chip Reese and a whole lot of other guys at the time, big players, over to Dublin, and we played a tournament in the Eccentric Club, which was only held at that time 4 tables maximum.
That close.